Today we'll talk about Chapter 6 in Conversation Analysis. This is called Turn-Taking System. Turn-taking system is one of the basic structural organizations CA has found. And this is one of the basic systems through which people coordinate their speakership. They decide who to talk next after whom, so they could order the speaking right in the conversation. So in this chapter, again, I'd like you to think about this issue. The first issue is, what does turn-taking system explain? So Harvey Sachs and Sugarloaf and Jefferson found turn-taking system to explain something, and I want you to find what that something is. If you know turn-taking, you can explain something and identify what that is. Second, there are some key concepts in turn-taking. The first one is turn constructional component. Turn constructional component meaning what makes a turn? What constitutes a turn? What is the component of turn? Second one is turn allocation component. So once you have a turn, you have to allocate. You have to give the turn to some people so that there's one person talk and then turn is allocated to another person. Then that person talks, and so on and so on. Third issue is a projectable completions. Project here means anticipate or expect. So turn is organized in such a way that people can project, people can anticipate when it's going to be completed. So that would be the basis for people to do a turn-taking from one person to the next and so on. And in the chapter, I put several excerpts, the data excerpts, and each of these excerpts is supposed to explain some phenomena. So I'd like you to figure out what phenomena each excerpt is going to explain. And in that way, you can identify the question and you can identify the answer. Not just answer, you have to identify what that answer is going to address in terms of what is being asked and so on. Another issue, this is presented at the end of the chapter, context-free and context-sensitive. So Harvey Sachs argued that turn-taking system has this quality, context-free and context-sensitive. It's sort of like paradoxical argument, but it'll make sense if you go through this text closely. And at the end, also, I'd like you to be able to write about turn-taking. So using turn-taking system, researchers can demonstrate and then put your argument there. Okay. Let's go to the chapter. So let me begin with what Harvey Sachs says. Harvey Sachs, the founder of the field, it's around here, was looking for some stable systems or mechanisms that makes conversation interaction possible. He first noted that people engage in conversation every day, regularly and systematically. Treating conversational exchanges as a recurrent event, Sachs wanted to describe a basic system that made this orderly phenomena possible, and turn-taking is one such system. So Harvey Sachs has a question. He noticed that people around him and people in the world in general, they have a conversation regularly. And in that conversation, people take turns, right, without too much troubles. So he figured there must be some sort of underlying system people agree, underlying system people follow. And he wanted to find the system. Once he found the system, he can explain how conversation is being done. Right? So that's the premise of the system he wanted to discover and develop. And turn-taking system is one such system. So let's go through some key concept. And in doing so, we're going to explore the questions that Harvey Sachs was trying to find answer for. Now, Harvey Sachs noticed that in conversation turn-taking happens regularly, and this is what the text is referring to here. Turn-taking system, the last paragraph, have been shown to handle two problems for the participants in carrying out their conversational task. So once you have such system called turn-taking, it can explain these two social phenomena people can produce. The first problem is how people know when to begin their turn. Unless they know how to begin, turn-taking can't happen, because otherwise there are going to be a lot of problems. Listeners pay attention to how speakers structure their turns in order to figure out when the current speaker is going to end and his or her turn. So, if you are the next speaker, if you want to speak next, then you have to figure out when the current turn by the current speaker is going to end. Then you can start your talk. This is what Sachs et al. Refers to as the turn constructional unit. Turn constructional component of the turn-taking system. They infer that unless there are some recognizable units, people would have difficulties in determining their turn to speak. So Harvey Sachs figured there must be some unit, some component that everybody agrees. Because if people agree on turn, it consists of this particular components, then they can, they would know when to begin their turn, and they would predict when the current turn is finished, and so on. The second issue, if there are more than two participants in conversation, how do people determine which of them will speak next? The first one was about the component of turn. The second one, once you know the component, second one would be how people know when to begin their turn. How do people determine which among the possible people, can talk? So you have 5 people in conversation, A, B, C, D, E. How do you know how to order the turn? A talk, and B talk, and C talk, and D talk, and E talks. How do you know? How do we know B comes after C? Or D comes after B, and so on and so on. So Sachs et al. Refers to this tonal allocation component, how to allocate, how to give out the turn so that people can order their turn. So if you look at this data, you have a conversation between Roy and Cindy, and Roy and Cindy, and Roy and Cindy. So two things. What are some components of turn? If turn happens to Roy, and then Cindy takes up the next turn, then we say Roy's turn has one component, and Cindy's turn has another component. And if you look at this, there's a one-word component like line 17, yeah, but then we have full sentence in line 23. So turn constructional component could be a word, or could be a phrase, or could be a full sentence. That's the first question. Second question is, how Cindy know when to begin her talk? Right? How Cindy, among all other people, how Cindy is the one who is going to speak next, and so on. That's the second component. So let's go to the down. Let's go to the down here. Note over here that the turn size or the length of turn is not fixed, but varies according to its context. It could be a one word or phrase or sentence. This means that the participants can analyze the turn in progress to predict when the turn will end. They anticipate projectable completions of the turn if they want to begin their talk. So we already talked about this. People can predict and anticipate their turn. because they have a good understanding of what constitutes a turn. Okay? So take a look at each data set to see what points each excerpt is trying to demonstrate. Let's move on to turn allocation. I'm going to read this part. In contrast, turn allocation is a conversational exchange. It's much more local and interactional in the sense that at the end of each turn, participants need to determine who among the possible candidates should take the next turn. In the case of friends chatting in a coffee shop, for example, if person A says, I had a dinner with him, then we went to see a movie, and then C responds, oh, really? Well, movie. Here, C, when he says, oh, really? What movie? Then C just nominates A because A saw the movie as the next speaker to answer his question. So that's one technique for in conversation as to determining who is going to speak next, which is the case of 1.A. Current speaker selects next. If that doesn't happen, if the current speaker doesn't select next, then any next speaker self-selects. So A is talking, and there are B and C and D, and if A doesn't select next speaker, B, C, D, anybody can self-select to speak. If B doesn't happen, which means A doesn't happen and B doesn't happen, then C, the current speaker continues. And rules A through C reapplies. Goes for A, doesn't happen, B, if it doesn't happen, then we go C, and so on. So the excerpt in the following pages demonstrate this point. So for example, in excerpt 19, if you look at R, hey, the place looks different. But then F says, yeah. R didn't necessarily point out who's going to speak next, although there are F and K. So F self-select, and then K also self-selects. So that's the case of Rule 1B, because A didn't happen, so participant go into B, and so on. Excerpt 20 is interesting. There's an overlap, and you certainly can explain why this is the case if you understand how this rule applies. And also if you understand the projectable completion, how people anticipate the end of the turn. Okay. So let's move on to the next issue. I'd like you to see the excerpt 22. Here, it's a pretty long excerpt from Harvey Sachs, their paper. Initially, I think there are 4 people in this conversation. Initially, just one person speaks at a time. So there's only one conversation going on. And then at the end, later on, there are 2 conversations. The first one is Louis and Ben. These 2 are talking. And then Max and Bill are talking. So if there are more than 3 people, if there are 4 people, then it is possible for there are going to be 2 conversations spreading out from an initial 1 conversation. Okay? So later on, let's look at this part. So in this section, we talked about turn component, what makes up a turn, and how that turn is allocated to determine the next speaker. So with turn-taking system, CA is equipped with technical resources to explain how conversational exchange is organized by those who are participants in it. So if you use a turn-taking system, then CA researchers can actually go in and analyze how people in each particular context coordinate their speakership. The system has an effect of obliging researchers to attend to what the participants see in the course of interaction and what kinds of choices they make in securing, releasing, and yielding and negotiating speakership. So knowing this rule is not enough. We have to apply this rule to each conversation interaction. So knowing the turn-taking system is just get you in only halfway. The rest of it, using this turn-taking system, you can determine, you can describe how people negotiate their turns about their speaking right. So in doing so, researchers can specify the process through which social actions are initiated, constituted, problematized by those participants. Okay? So using this turn-taking system, if you look at the conversation exchange very closely, then you will be able to find some eccentric phenomena. For example, if one person is insisting on talking and without getting interrupted by other people, she or she may use particular strategies to do that. If there are a lot of overlaps, then we would say, well, there must be some conflict between these two people, because normally one person speaks at a time, and if there are an overlap, one person typically opts out. But if two people insist on talking and keep interacting each other, then you can kind of project some problems in the conversation. Okay? So turn-taking system allow us to get into very specific details in which people negotiate their speakership. Maybe they found some problems, they have some conflicts, and how they bring that conflict into a close in the course of interactions and so on. Page 57, I'd like to think about the relevance of this conversational system. Here, the last paragraph, with regard to turn-taking systems, Saxon, Shogoloff, and Jefferson consider them to be a stable organizational skeleton that allows researchers to specify the central features of turn allocation and turn transitions while explaining variance and divergences. So, these researchers, particularly Harvey Sachs, thought that turn-taking system is a basic system of all kinds of interaction. So conversational turn-taking becomes a basic. And once we know the basic, then we can see the variations of it. For example, classroom interaction or courtroom procedures show different kind of turn-taking system. And we can understand that system because we are already familiar with the basic conversational system. So I have a sort of analogy here in thinking about conversation system using the sentence. If we know the system called the sentence is one way for us to categorize the language. So if we have some system called the sentence, then we can say there's a simple sentence, complex sentence, coordinate sentence, and so on. So using this system, we can identify the features of particular conversation or written passages. This is complex, this is formal, informal, and so on. So turn-taking system works like that basic system through which we can identify some specific details in different contexts. So in the next page, I concluded here by discussing what Harvey Sachs calls context-free and context-independent of turn-taking system. So turn-taking system is context-free because it's so basic. It really doesn't matter who is the speaker. It could be a Korean, American, female, male, kids, adult. The turn-taking system allow us to analyze the conversational structures that could be applied to all kinds of different people. So in that sense, context-free. It's free from all different contexts. At the same time, it is context-sensitive. Using turn-taking system, we can examine the specific features of particular setting, particular conversation. For example, one conversation among friends, there's a lot of turn-taking happens, a lot of collaborative work. But on the other hand, we have a very serious conflict between three people in conversation. Even that conflict, we can identify the nature of the conflict through using the basic turn-taking system. So in that sense of the turn, context-free at the same time, context-sensitive. And here I says, turn-taking system is considered to be context-free if, without knowing who is speaking and under what context, researchers can identify and explain how the participants are negotiating their participation. So for example, speaker changes occur or two conversations take place and so on. At the same time, this turn-taking system allows us to identify variations and differences among different contexts and participation. Friend chatting, greeting among strangers, and classroom interactions, and so on. Okay? So, turn-taking system is one of very first mechanisms Harvey Sachs and Shogoloff and Jefferson found. And in 1974 paper that was published in Language, which is the most cited paper in discourse analysis. And then later on, they published another mechanism called repair in 1977. And then later on, other researchers found preference, adjacency pair, and so on. So in this chapter, in this book, we'll examine few of those mechanisms so that you can use them to analyze some distinctive database that you're going to work with. Okay? So next class, we're going to talk about adjacency pair and preference. Thank you.